Hello to everybody who has just joined us here. We are doing our Measure Master live training right now. We're gonna get started in about 5 minutes, so you need to stay tuned. If you watch this on the replay, we will have a timestamp down below that you can click in order to jump forward on this. Now I'm gonna go through and post this to our group here. And let's also put this into the channel membership. And one thing I didn't do yet, it might be something I wanna do right now, is to actually put our chat into this as well. So where do we have our chat? Here's our chat. And now I need to get the chat window to populate with your chat. Nobody has written anything yet. If you can't hear me, if you can hear me, then please let me know. The microphone works as well. And now the chat disappeared for some reason. Let me know if you can hear me. We're gonna get started in just about 3-4 minutes. And I just wanna make sure that we have everything set up correctly. So if you put your name in there and where you're watching this from, and if you can hear me, then you will come onto the screen and you'll be able to see yourself, hopefully. I will write something, okay. Let's see if this works. Not too many people online. So we moved the actual live stream, the Measure Masters live stream, to a later time. Now it's 3 p.m. UTC or 4 p.m. here in Germany. And I hope some more Americans can see this and say, because I got some feedback last time saying that it should be a bit later in the day so Americans can join. But obviously it's always a tricky thing because here in Europe, people tend to leave work at this time. Well, 4 o'clock is a bit early if you're working till 4. And on the other hand, there are other people who are sleeping already. So Australians or Asians. And since we're an international group, this might be something to take into consideration. So I wanted to try it out actually to see whether it works. Gonna get started in a second here. I'm gonna put this up on a announcement and see how many people will join us. Now, just to briefly explain the rules here, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a presentation on DataStudio formulas and with some examples, of course. So it's not just gonna be presentation. Today, it's actually gonna be less presentation than demos. So we're gonna go through actual demos. Now, during that time, I won't be able to actually read the chat or pick up on any questions that you might write, any questions that you might have, because I'm going through the presentation at the same time. So what I want you to do is just simply, if you have a question, put this into the chat, and at the end we have a Q&A section where I'll be answering your questions. All right, it's just about time. There are not really a lot of people online right now. Maybe that's due to the time change that we have done. But nonetheless, I want to get started. And I welcome everybody who has joined us today. So let's dive into our presentation and get started. Hello, Measure Masters. Welcome to this month's Measure Masters live training. Today we're going to talk about DataStudio formulas, or functions, how they are also called, or calculated fields, how they're also called. So don't get confused if you don't know yet what formulas are. I'm going to introduce this in a second here. Now, this is a series that we do every month. If you have any questions during the presentation, then please leave them in the chat. If you are live right here, welcome to this live stream. If you are watching this on the replay, hello as well. If you have any questions, you can always put this into the comment section and I'll try to answer them at a later stage. Now, without further ado, let's get started with our presentation. Today, we're going to have a little bit of presentation, but moreover, some demos that I have prepared here. Okay, I'm going to pull down my headphones here a little bit. And just look into the chat. Ricardo is here. Hey, Ricardo, good to have you. Let's get started. First of all, I want to talk about ETL. Now, ETL might be a new term to you as it actually originates from computer programming. And if you look at the old times of trying to get insights from your data, what do you have to do? You probably ran to your developer and went through an ETL process. ETL stands for extract, transform, load, which means we need to extract the data first that we want to analyze. In a perfect world, obviously, you would have all the data that you need prepared correctly, but in reality, most of the time, you get a lot of data that is not cleaned. So you would need to filter out some data, you would need to change around values, you would need to calculate some values, and then you have a data set that you can work with, and then you would load it into your system. That might be, in older terms, an Excel or Google spreadsheet, and there you can do your analysis and your visualizations later on. Now, this is the ETL process that really happens in the background in a lot of systems already. Let's take a look at Google Analytics, for example. ETL means it's measuring for us. It puts it into the database. It actually does a lot of processing beforehand. So if you send out over page views, these get put into the session scope or the user scope. And then we get the presentation on the presentation layer where we can do a little bit more analysis, so we can do segmentations and so on, and filtering, obviously. But really, this is the presentation layer already. This is where you do your analysis. So it already loaded it into Google Analytics. So in a sense, Google Analytics really does ETL already. Now, what about Google Data Studio, the topic that we are going to talk about today? Google Data Studio actually extracts data as well. It pulls data from different systems. Now, there might be a bit more clean than just taking raw data, but it doesn't really matter because we always pull data from somewhere via connectors. These are our data sources. Then we take these data sources and we can actually do some transformation to them. And this is what we're going to talk about today. And then we have the load process where we start visualizing our data. So what we're talking about today, just to put this into a perspective, is this second step, the transform. Now, transformation is not a strong suit of a data visualization tool or like Google Data Studio, as it is more focused on data visualization. So the cleaning, the filtering, the calculating, the changing, normally would be done already inside of the data source. So you might remember back 1-2 years ago when DataStudio first came out, you really had to put all your data first into a Google Sheet and then pull out the data that you wanted, calculate some fields, clean out some data that was messy, and then you would load it all up into DataStudio. Now, this has been really something that bothered a lot of people, as we have a lot of connectors available. We can pull data in, and obviously in terms of automation, what the step that you want to get to within Google Data Studio, you need to have the transformation step in there as well. So you won't be necessarily needing it to pump it through another tool like Google Sheets. That bothered a lot of people, and Google Data Studio has reacted and built in this feature. Now, this feature is really transformation of data. So once you have the data in your systems, then you can transform it. That doesn't mean if the data is faulty, you can just turn it around or go into one or the other data point and then say, oh, I really want to have a different name here for this page view, right? It just means that we have some operations now available. We can change around the data to make it more fitting for our data visualization. So let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about formulas, and this is the transformational process here. We're first going to talk about what are formulas. We're going to talk about custom metrics and custom dimensions. Although these terms are not really used in Data Studio, we know them hopefully from Google Analytics, and this is how you can customize your tracking in Google Analytics. We can also take the same analogy over to Data Studio, and I'm going to show you how you can build in custom metrics and custom dimensions. And then we'll get into a lot of examples here, aggregating values, changing values around, extracting data, rewriting data, filtering data, and grouping data. And I have a few examples here for you. There are a lot of formulas out there. Obviously, we won't go through all of them, but for special cases, you might want to look them up later on. I'm going to go through probably the most used formulas or functions that you would come across in your daily work. All right, without further ado, let's get started. What are formulas? Let's go into the first example here. Now, here I have a Google spreadsheet, really easily explained. If you are not familiar with a spreadsheet software, then this is something that I wholeheartedly would recommend to you to get to know, just from a perspective of understanding data better. Now, I won't go into how Google Sheets works, but you probably know that you will be able to do some dynamic calculations in a spreadsheet. And this is done via formulas. Now, formulas always start with a equal sign. So here we have an equal sign, and this starts a formula. We can type in a variable. For example, we would like to calculate the conversion rate, which means we have here our conversions, which are 11, and I want to divide them, and I'm just going to put the divide sign in here by the clicks. Press enter, and we get our conversion rate in percent. Normally it would be a number, but I already changed the format to, so normally it would be a number, but I already changed the format to the percent sign. All right. You might know also that you can copy this little formula, DC2, C2, so always these two fields, down in order to calculate the other conversion rates. So per day, per source, we now have these different conversion rates in here. What we can also do are using pre-made functions. So obviously we could do equal sign, and then we could say, I want to calculate right now this field plus this field plus this field, and so on and so on. And we would get a sum down here. Now, there are also pre-built formulas, functions, like also in Data Studio, that we can utilize, which is the equal sign, and then we get to the functions that we can enter. So there's a function called sum, and we just put in sum, and every function, like in programming if you know it, has a parameter that we can feed into it. In our case, it would be which fields do we want to feed into this sum function. I'm opening up parentheses here because that's where the parameters go. I'm going to mark all the different fields that I want to sum up. Press enter, and here we go. We have summed up the revenue field. By the way, you can also copy this over and could summarize these fields. In that case, we have used functions within Google Sheets to calculate some fields. And it's basically the same concept in DataStudio. So here we have a sheet. We have our clicks and conversions. That's actually pulled from this sheet. What if I wanted to build a conversion rate column here? I would need to calculate this. And this is what's been going on with formulas and functions. Now you can enter formulas and functions in two ways. One is directly in the chart itself. That would be done down here by adding a metric, and then you can create a field down here, and then it will give you this little thing. You stay in DataStudio, and this is only valid for this chart or this visualization, but you could also put it into your data source directly, which is then available to all of your data fields. And this is done by clicking down here to create a new field. And we have a little editor here where we can enter our new field name. For example, the conversion rate. And then like in like in Google Sheets, we can now choose from the available fields that we have available. In our case, it would be the conversions. I put the divided sign in, divided by the clicks, and it's calculating down here because it will give you actually hints if the formula syntax is correct, and Google DataStudio can interpret this. So now that it's all good, by the way, you can leave the field ID as it is unless you have a naming convention for your fields. We'll save this. And now it should become available inside of our data source right here. So we have here conversion rate, and let's plop that in. And as we can see, we now have a conversion rate right here. Now this is not the right type. If you wanted to change the type, we need to go back into our data source here, and conversion rate is now a number, but we would like to change it to a numeric type, a percentage. Let's see, and it recalculates it. So we have basically the same result as inside of Google Sheets. This is how you can utilize functions, and the function itself is really just the thing that you put into that field in order to calculate it. And there are different functions out there that you could utilize. There's actually a list on the DataStudio help section, and there are quite a lot. Not all of them are oftentimes used, but I would encourage you to take a look at this right here. All right, let's continue with our next section, which is custom metrics. And what we have just done is actually already creating a custom metric. Just a little primer or a recap on what are metrics, what are dimensions. If you look at this sheet here, you have different data points, and these different data points are represented by the rows. So each row means something. And in our case, it would mean that these are clicks, for example. Now, every data point that describes our data, so our clicks, this is a dimension. For example, in this case, it would be what describes the clicks? Well, the source. The conversions, not really. They are also metrics. The revenue, yes, that could be describing the overall row right here. So the revenue is also a dimension. And in DataStudio, you can see dimension in metrics inside right here. They are represented by green if they are dimension or blue if they are metric. Now what we have just done right here in the conversion column is, I'm going to go back to the data source, create a new metric. It is blue and it's the conversion rate, which means a metric can be calculated. It can actually be summed up. It could be calculated further, divided by 2, plus 3, whatever, which is normally not possible with a dimension, because a dimension value is actually something that is describing data. Now, in terms of the revenue, you could actually calculate it, obviously, but again, if this really describes the data that we are putting into our system, then it is aligned with the actual data point. Now, you already saw in the presentation, we actually want to also talk about custom dimensions. Custom dimensions can also be calculated in a way that can be changed. They can be put in. What is a dimension again? It's a simple descriptor of our data. So if you would like to put in another descriptor onto your metric, you would need to either put this on the measurement side, and this is where custom dimensions with Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager come in, or you would need to derive them from your existing data source. Let me show you an example. So if you go back here and go to our next example, all right, this is a bit small, I guess, for you guys. I'm gonna try to build up the values here. Well, it's a bit too big. Now, as you can see here, we have the source. And the source is Facebook, Google, and so on. If you take out the date column, actually, let's take out the date range. We see here that, for example, Facebook is differently typed every time. That might be a case where you would have a user that puts in UTM parameters not according to a naming convention, and you end up with these different sources, although they are all the same, right? Normally you would need to take the Facebook source here and the Facebook source here together with this one, and then it would become #1 traffic source. So it's actually a little bit misleading what we're seeing here, as these are one and the same source. So how can we combine them? We can build a custom dimension, and this is easily done by going into our create field again, and let's build a clean source right here. And this clean source will simply use the formula lower and put our field expression in. And this field is our source right here. Let's save this. And now we have it available here inside of our metrics and dimension picker right here. And let's just replace our clean source, or source, with our clean source. And here we go. We have Facebook and Google, and they have been calculated together or summed up together automatically. And this is how you can get clean data, for example, inside of your source. So this is an example for a custom dimension. And yeah, it really just works because it's actually pulling from the data that we have available inside of our systems already. Now, if you would like to put in a custom dimension, for example, the user ID or so, that's not something you can do via Google Data Studio. It's just something that is based on your existing data. And if you would like to have the client ID in there, you would actually need to build it into your measurement side. So Google Tag Manager, Google Analytics. But it's an example of a custom dimension. Now let's go into some more examples here. Now that you know what a dimension and metric value are, and we'll be able to do more and go through some more interesting examples. I'm just seeing that I'm on the lower side here. And I'm gonna switch over to be up here. That would make a little bit more sense. All right, I have some examples here. Not sure why this is not coming through. So I love this about DataStudio. They always give you these cryptic little, down here, error messages, and then you don't know why your data is not set up correctly. All right, here we have another sheet with the revenue, conversions, and clicks. And now we want to utilize aggregate methods and arithmetic methods as well. What does that mean? Well, we have these functions in here, and like we did with sum, we can build a single metric, and this is important because it doesn't really work when you put this into a table, but a single metric based on all these metrics that are, for example, in the revenue field. So what if you wanted to calculate the full amount of the revenue, and how would you be able to do something like this? We can utilize the scorecard right here. Which, if I change this over to revenue, probably already gives me the sum. What is going on here? Probably, again, a different data source. Let me get rid of this. And now we're gonna go with our demo sheet. Right. And this time I'm gonna choose our revenue here. And it's gonna give me the sum of the revenue. So that's something Google Data Studio already does automatically. So doing a sum formula, you can utilize the sum formula just by building a new sheet and revenue sum, and then using the sum formula just like in Sheets. This wouldn't make much sense because this scorecard already does it automatically. So let's go with something more interesting, the median. We have the median of our revenue. Let's save this. And let's change. Here's our revenue sum. I called it sum, although it's a median. So that should be our median. I'm gonna rename this really quickly. To go in median. So you can see you can use these aggregate methods that you have available in the list. For example, to find out the maximum, the median, the minimum, the percentile. So when does let's try this out, percentile XY. So I'm just gonna change this around, revenue percentile. Let's say we wanna have the 90 percentile. And as the formula, we have percentile. Now we are taking our revenue as the first parameter, and then we need to put in a number between 0 and 100, which are the percentile. So if I want to get the 90 percentile, I just press 90 here and update this. and it should be at $822. So then you could look at that data and say, oh, okay, this one is in a 10%, in a 90% percentile, or above. It's above the 90% percentile. And this value. All the other values from our table are not in that percentile. So really few aggregations that you can do. I don't know how useful this is to you. There are some arithmetic, is it arithmetic? Formulas as well, like to get, an easy one would be to round a value. So if you have, we have pretty good values here, but if you have floating values, you could round them up or down based on what you want, how many floating values you want to show. Then there are some date and geo here. I won't go through them right now because this is for working with date fields and geomaterial, obviously. Rather go through some more interesting examples for you guys. We're gonna go over to the text. Now with text we can do a lot. We already saw that we can lowercase something. So right here we have Facebook, we already done this. What if we have something like this? I don't know if you can see this. Oh, this was just a table header. I don't want to increase the table header. So right here we have a page path that obviously has something, a query string in it, which shows the actual search term that the user used, maybe on your website, where you'd say, okay, if the user types this into my website, I get this query string, and now I have this all over my page path. What do I do? Well, you can actually turn this into useful information by extracting the value from whatever is behind the Q equals and making a search report out of it, right? How would you do this? Well, you would need to extract this data. Let's do this. I'm gonna go back to our data, create a new field, and here we're gonna put in our search term, or could call it query string, whatever. And as the input, now we're gonna utilize a formula called regex extract. And this takes a field, so in our case, the page path, and evaluates it based on our regex pattern. So if you don't know what regex is, it's basically a method or a way to format a search query for text to evaluate text based on that. And it gets kind of complicated, but it's super useful for any kind of data analysis. So if you haven't yet, definitely look this up. I also have a video on the channel that explains this a little bit. Now the regex that we are going to use here is to pull out everything that is behind the queue. And the way of doing this in regex is to enter the string, so this will be found. Now I want to actually capture the group that is behind the queue, and it doesn't matter how long it is behind the queue, I want to pull that stuff out. So you would do this with the dot star. Let's try this out. I'm gonna save this. Let's finish up, and I'm gonna add our search term to our dimensions. And here we go. It pulled out the different signs here from our search string. So if I just wanted to show or present that data later on, I could get rid of the page path, and obviously now the user has a more user-friendly view of the search terms. Excuse me. So really extracting data with this regex extract formula is pretty easy. Let's go on to our next example here. This is our page path. I'm gonna make this a bit more readable. Here we have our page path. Now, this really is a data set that you might encounter if you have multiple websites and they are all tracking into one Google Analytics account. You might see there is the page path / which is normally the homepage that has 2,500 page views. But if you add something like the host name to the dimensions, you would see that it would split this up because we actually have different domains that we are tracking from. And as you might see here, I'm gonna make this, try to fit this on the screen. We have customer.demoshop.com, blog.demoshop.com, and these obviously all have home pages, and therefore it is misleading what the report shows us when we just look at the page path. So what we do normally in Google Analytics is to build a filter to include that into our domain. But if you haven't done that in your data source itself, you would need to include this via a formula. And the formula that you might know is concatenate. So we would like to add this part of the URL to this part of the URL and make a new page path out of it, or a full page path. Easy formula for this as well. We go to create a new field. Let's call this full URL. Whoops. Full URL. And at this point, we're gonna use the concatenate formula, and it takes two inputs, X and Y. In our case, the X should be the host name and the Y should be our page path. It says it didn't expect this because we don't have a comma here. It needs to actually have a comma in between those two. Yes, that's correct. Let's save this. Finish up. Put this into our report instead of, well, we can put it right here. Instead of our full URL, we now see our full URL that is split up by the host name and the page path. So we have created a new dimension here. We have taken two dimensions that we already have and put them together. So concatenate is the formula to do that. There are a lot more of these different kind of text iterating or changing formulas. Just to give you a context, we have concat. We can create a hyperlink to take the URL and then a link, put this together. It would be HTML almost, because we would write something like ahref. We can generate the length of the actual string that we feed into it. Pretty useful when it comes to analyzing, for example, the page title, right? If you wanted to look at the page title and say, do longer page titles get more SEO traffic, for example? Answer that question. You would have that formula available in order to calculate the length without needing to go into a spreadsheet or so. We have lower, we use this already. Regex extract, regex match we'll get to in a second. And we even have replace. So our example here would be if we have flying plus ninja, the plus is just in there because it's URL encoded. If we wanted to replace this by a space, we could do this with this replace functionality as well. Or substring, it's something that I often use in JavaScript. So if I wanted to cut off the beginning or the end of a sentence, just because the beginning is always, I don't know, a hyphen or a dot or whatever, I would be able to pinch that off from the beginning or the end. And then we have trim functionality. The trim functionality is actually something, if you have a lot of spaces that have been sent into Google Analytics, for example, you could get rid of them. This is where the white space is actually getting rid of. So quite useful functions when you want to use text. All right, and now let's get to the more interesting one, or the one that most of you guys out there already use. It's the case formula. Let me just increase the labels here as well again. Now this is a language learning website, and let's say I would just take out the search queries that were searched on the website itself and wanted to get some insights from them. The interesting part here is if I would say, well, I already know that people are interested in their own language, and so they put in Spanish or French or whatever they want to learn, their target language, so to say. What if there are some of these, and if we go through them here, I actually gonna go to the next and the next. Here. So here is a question that is how. And these are always interesting because we would know the intent. We would get a bit more insights about what the user is up to and what he might want to learn from us if we don't have content yet. And so we would go on to this search functionality and find out, okay, how to learn French. Oh, I don't have a tutorial on that yet. Maybe we should make something on this. So these how and the why and the when, for example, are really interesting search terms that we want to filter out. There are different ways in Google DataStudio to filter, but right now we want to obviously use formulas to do this. So what we can do is actually use the regex match option or formula. How will we do that? Let's go over and create a new field again. And in our case, we would like to know if there is a what, when, how question. We will use, as I already mentioned, the regex match option right here. And as the input, we need to put in a dimension. In our case, it would be the query dimension right here. And then we need to put in a regular expression. This regular expression needs to be, again, formatted correctly. So you'd be able to pick up all the hows and the when and the whys. What is this in this case? It would be, for example, if I wanted to get the why, I don't care where it is in the sentence. So if something is before or after, I don't care. So this time I will put in the dot star, the why, my search term, and then again dot star, whether it's there or not, it will pick it up. Let's actually go with how first. The cool thing, if you have your data source open, and I would encourage this because Google DataStudio sometimes is really slow and it is hard to test things really if you have to go back and forth. So have it open in a table just like this, and then you can click save already. It will update the field and it should, then we have to go on finish, unfortunately. We can now put our query in here, our what, when, where query as a dimension. And now we should get another column. Now this is odd. We have here how. Let me see. What did we have in here? probably, is this case sensitive? Save this, update this. How are you? Somebody type that in. So now we have it here as true. So we would also need to account for the different, that would be hard. Okay, the different cases as well, which is unfortunate. Let's actually do something else beforehand. Let's build a field. And the field is just lowercase all the queries. Okay. And obviously we again take the lower and take our query, save this. And now we need to look how the query looks like. I'm gonna replace this with our query dimension. And now it should say, well, we are at 100 here, but let's say the how should be lowercase now. And we can actually sometimes, and this is only for sometimes, we can actually utilize different fields that we already created inside of other formulas again. So in our case, that would be our what, when, why question. No, cancel. Go back here. We are not gonna take our query formula, but our lowercase queries. So now it should work for uppercase and lowercase. I'm gonna update this. And then you can always see whether something works or not. In our case right now, we don't have a how question, unfortunately. But we'll get to this in a second. Now, what you can also do in regex is to utilize the pipe. The pipe is the expression for or in regex, and we can type in more of these. So how, what, oops, the pipe, when, is there another one I forgot? Who, where, we don't have where. All right, let's update this and finish up. And now I'm gonna go on to review again, just so we have some more. Which language, which, did we have which in there? That's actually a good one as well. Sorry about that, forgot it. Need to change and add another one. Update this. And update, we're ready to go. So let's go back to our data source. Which languages? So now this is true. And all of these that have which, how, who, where have a true value in here because this is actually Boolean, so true or false. And we can utilize this to filter our data based on this field, if it's true or not. How would we do this? And this is a bit backwards because you have different methods of doing this, obviously, in DataStudio. But right here inside of our filter, we can add a new filter. We say we just want to have the what, when, how, which questions. And we're going to only include the field of query. No, not query. Lower, no, what, when, where, how questions, if this is actually true. Let's save this. And we have now filtered our data only on this how, when, what, where, who questions. Now, I already told you that I would like to talk about the case variable, which is the most complicated, but probably also the most useful one in our cases when we work with data in DataStudio. With the case variable, we can actually take this up a notch, and I'm going to show you right now. So what a case variable does is puts a structure in there. So if this, then that, you know that if TT. If this, then that, you can build that into a formula in order to rewrite values or to classify values. Let me show you an example. We can take this up a notch and say, okay, we have built this little formula. So this is quite useful already. Let's just copy this and build a new field. This is gonna be our category why, what, when, who. And I'm gonna start writing a case formula. Now the case formula has a special format. It starts with case, it ends with end, and in between you have your conditions. So a condition might be something like when a field, like a query, equals 1, 2, 3, then rewrite this into or output 1, 2, 1, 2, 2. For example, this is just an example. Now what we are going to do is take our regex match. So when the regex matches with how, let's go with how here first. Then I want to rewrite this into how. Now what will happen is all these values will not be true anymore, but rather it would say how or when or what, depending on what we put in here as the query string. I have prepared something already because it will take me too long time to write this all out. So here we go. We have the query. Well, it shouldn't be the query. It should be lower query actually. And that's something I didn't plan for. Lower queries. No. This one. Can I copy this? Okay, let me just do this in my text editor on the other window here. Lower queries. Just 1 second. Gonna copy this over here. This window is very, very small, so you might not be able. So we start a case here when the lower queries are why, then put in this why, how, when, where, who. Actually, I also want to have one for which. So which. Okay, let's save this. And finish this up. And now we have this category dimension. I'm going to put this into the dimension itself. And now we see, obviously, it's already filtered based on how, which, when, who, and so on. Now, the cool thing about this is if we had another, let's copy this dimension, this chart, and just paste this in again. So we have the same data sources and so on, but I'm going to get rid of all these other dimensions. So we only have our category. Now here we see how many of our search phrases have the actual how, which, when, who, and where in them. If we now go back to our original data set, let me put in the lower queries here. We can build an interactive sheet by making this our filter sheet. How does that work? Well, down here you have the ability to apply filter. This is the interaction stuff that you can do within a chart. And if the user now is on a chart and looks at all the how, when, where questions, he only wants to learn about the which. He just clicks on it and it will change all the filter settings to only show where this actually applies. So this is great for keyword research if you wanted to look at all the how questions, about the which questions, about the when questions. Call me, I like when. Whom? It's a search phrase, so we can't really see everything right here. But this is great if you have a big data set. For example, Google Search Console, you can connect it to your DataStudio and build this kind of report to see and filter on the fly who, when, what, where, and so on. I think this is great if you do keyword research, or if you have a data set like AdWords and you want to just know which keywords perform well, you could build your little interaction sheet in order to click on something, and then you'd be able to also see this in the other sheets. So the case variable here is really useful. Cool. We went through all our little program here. I might also want to show you channel grouping if you have a little bit more time. It seems so. Now, channel grouping is something you can actually build into Google Analytics, as you might be aware. Google Analytics provides the ability to group all your different channels that are coming in into different groups. So, should I show this? Well, it's just something you can do in Google Analytics in order to not have the source medium report in front of you and say, oh, Google CPC, but rather a different name for it, like paid advertising, for example. Now in Google Analytics, you can set up rules. So every time a page view comes in, it will be classified, or the source will be classified in a certain sense. Within DataStudio, you can also do something similar with the case variable. And this is particularly useful if you haven't bothered with any channel grouping or even content grouping. So we can retroactively go into our data set and say, okay, let's classify all of these sources into the referral bucket and all of these sources into the Facebook bucket or whatever. How would you do this? Exactly the same way. We have a case variable, and I will just go ahead and build one right now. We are gonna, and this is Google Analytics dataset. We can create a new field, and we're gonna call this the custom channel grouping, and we're gonna build a case variable. Now, a case variable has an end to it. We would have a regex match option again. Why doesn't it? Oh, when, and now regex match. Oh, it doesn't reg. Here you have a big data set, so it might take a while for Google Analytics to give us, well, a result. Anyways, I have a example here already prepared, so we don't have to type it all out. What you would do is use again regex match, and you would look at the source medium right here, and you would say, okay, if this is Google Organic, I wanna put this into the bucket of search engine. If I have direct traffic, I wanna put this into the dark traffic column, because I don't want to present the data and tell people about, oh, people came through direct. As you as a measurer probably know, this is simply dark traffic. We don't know where it's coming from, but something is going wrong here. Might be somebody coming through a website directly, but most of the time it's wrong URLs and so on. We have referral traffic, we have paid traffic, for example, right? So we put this into the different buckets here, and you even have a else bucket, which is like, if I can't find any match, put this into the else bucket. So we can do this and just create this. All right, now it's saved. And let's add this to our custom channel grouping, to our dimensions. And now you see that Google CPC was put into the search engines, direct none was put into dark traffic, then we have paid, we have others. Now affiliate, for example, I would put this also into a different bucket, but I didn't do this in this example here. And in the end, you might only want to present the data and say, okay, I'm gonna take out the source medium and actually only look at this data. How neat is that? It's much smaller, but it gives a much better overview of what is the actual traffic that the user is looking at right now. So DataStudio can really help you also to classify data retroactively, what Google Analytics can't do, and pull this out for you to rewrite or aggregate and classify data into different buckets. This can be done with channel grouping, but obviously also with, not path grouping, what's it called? Content grouping. So content grouping is also a feature of Google Analytics. If you haven't bothered doing this and you want to present the data in a certain way, so all the page views that came from the category X, if you haven't built that into Google Analytics, you would be able to do it now with DataStudio if you present that data through the DataStudio. So really a great use case again of the case variable, and this is something I would wholeheartedly recommend to try out on your own if you have that kind of case where you can utilize this. All right, this is it with our little presentation today. I hope you found it useful. Now we go into the Q&A section. If you are live right now, do we have a few people? Ricardo is still here, that's great. And JJ says he has no idea what I'm doing. Might be that you have tuned in too late, but if you have any questions, please let me know and I will answer them in a second. So if you guys have any questions who are online, let me know. Otherwise, we will go through some questions that I got beforehand via email. And feel free to ask me anything, right? This is quite open. Number one is Romeu. He says, what type of tracking system would you set up for a SaaS company that has one domain for the homepage and another subdomain, which is a web app that customers use? Now, luckily, we actually did a series with the help of Ruben Orgate from Practico Analytics on the Measure School channel, which he recommends his SaaS stack that you would be able, let me correct. Let's go this way. So there's this series on the Measure School channel that you can go through. We have published everything. The last video is not yet published, it will come out tomorrow. But there he explains all the different tools that he would use throughout the lifetime of the user. Now, the takeaway, just to wrap it all up for you really quickly, what I've learned from this is that a SaaS is a very specialized business that doesn't really fit into one tool set and certainly not into one Google Analytics. Why? Because the user normally goes through different stages. He is acquired by you, so he comes to your website somehow. He then signs up for a free trial. You want him to go through different steps. You want him to then convert into a paying user. Even if he's a paying user, you want to keep him around, so you want him to make certain decisions, for example, put in projects or take out open tickets or invite colleagues to the SaaS app. Let's take Slack, for example. And then in the end, you want to keep him around, obviously, and you want to look at all the interesting metrics that a SaaS business provides, which is monthly recurring revenue, annual recurring revenue, churn, very important, and maybe other user engagement metrics. Now, Google Analytics is a great tool when it comes to measuring the marketing side. So how many people came from a given source, how many then converted. And this is the first part that you should actually track with Google Analytics. So a user comes to the page, and it's really good to track this with Google Analytics. But then when the user actually enters your app, you have a subdomain, for example. You want to be able to track logins, and you want to not do this on a JavaScript basis, which is like mainly cookie based, but rather on a user ID basis. And you want to track how many of the users take certain actions that leads them to the goal of actually converting to a user, for example, or to a paid member, a paid customer. Now, I would say that Google Analytics is capable of doing it, but you would need to do a lot of customizations. And even the reporting is not really laid out for it. A better solution might be something that is more event-based, such as a mix panel or a amplitude analytics, in order to track these different events once the user is logged in. Even with the tracking side, so we oftentimes use Google Tag Manager to do things in the marketing scope of things. But this is JavaScript based. So if you have a web app, you might also have a mobile app where the user can log in. And this is when it gets really complicated, and Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics are mainly used for the web nowadays. If you want to tie this all together, you might need to use a new tagging system. And segment.com sometimes, for example, provides a backend or a server-side tracking system that allows us to do something like this. So even on the Google Tag Manager side, I wouldn't be quite comfortable on using, if you have different systems, to track your SaaS app. You might want to use something like Segment, then transfer the data to a more event-based driven tool like a Amplitude Analytics. And last but not least, these metrics like churn and recurring revenue. Google Analytics is mainly based on the system, when you look in the transaction report, of users who have visited the thank you page. And this is something that you won't be able to track with Google Analytics that easily. And therefore, I would just build a tool, or I wouldn't build a tool, but you could utilize either on a cheap Google DataStudio to pull out the data from your database, so each transaction, and then try to analyze it. You have all the formulas available. You could do this in a sheet. You could also do this automatically via software like Baremetrics or Recurly, I think it's called. But for real tool recommendations, go over to the videos and look through those. I thought they were really helpful if it comes to a SaaS business. I hope that answers your question, Romeu. Thanks for the question. And we go on and talk about, Bruna. Bruna's asked, he has 3 environments, dev, staging, and production. I'd like to know how I can remove dev and staging, which have a beginning like, okay, from the production reporting in analytics. Now, in analytics, you probably mean Google Analytics, and you probably have Google Analytics installed on all those 3 pages. So you have it on dev, on staging, and on your live site. There are 2 ways of getting rid of this. Number 1, stop tracking your dev and your staging side. Obviously, this is something, if you would stop it on the measurement side, get rid of this. You could also do some fancy stuff in Google Tag Manager to automatically detect the URL on the top, and if it's dev, don't fire the tag. And then it would be filtered out on the measurement side automatically. You could also utilize something in Google Tag Manager called environments, where you have different kind of container snippets available for different environments that you're working on. And you simply would say, I only want to fire our Google Analytics tag when we are actually on the live site. This is the measurement side, and this is pretty easy and no-brainer. The data even doesn't get to Google Analytics. If you want to have it easier and you don't want to go through the hassle, you might want to install a filter, and this would be on the actual platform side. So on Google Analytics, under the view settings, you have the ability to add filters, and you can filter out the host name. So you would build a hostname filter where you say def dot blah 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 is something I don't want to have in my reports. I think you can figure this out on your own. If you need an example, just let me know and I will provide it to you. Next up, we have Ryan, and this is something I discussed with Ryan already on an email, but I want to retell it right here as it's actually DataStudio and it's quite interesting. Are you able to create a month-on-month calculation in DataStudio? I know that previous year and previous period are available, but not a true month-to-month calculation. This previous period will take the month and compare it to the same number of previous days. The only workaround I found is to put the data in a calculation into Google Sheets and import the data. Is there any workaround for this? Well, there is, and just as an example, if we have two data sets, well, let's go back to our case here. No. Channel grouping. Oh yeah, this is channel grouping. This is already our Google Analytics source. So what if we would like to build this in to, and to be honest, probably Ryan has built a control structure, the date range control in here. So right here, and he also, yeah, what I think he wants to do is take that data and then say, okay, I want to do a month-on-month comparison. So I would like to have March 31st. Well, no, beginning and end. Let's do March 30. Well, this is not a good month because it's not yet done. Let's go with January here. So we go with 1st of January right here. Then he wants to compare this to the previous month, for example. What you can do here is obviously use the last 30 days as a comparison. No, let me see. Why can't we compare data right now? So this is actually using a fixed data range, right? Might be not available in our chart as we have calculated this differently. But it should be possible. Ah, yeah. So here we can put in a comparison and we can actually say that we would like to compare this data based on, so this is our comparison date range. And here we can choose the comparison and we would say, okay, since we have the 1st of June, we will take the 1st of December and put this to 30th. So now we have compared both of these directly. Now, this is unfortunately only possible if you used fixed date ranges. So you wouldn't be able to say, okay, I'm changing around a date here and I want to compare it to the first month. So I wouldn't be able to say this is the previous month, right? Oh, now it's small. Now it's small. It's bigger. So this wouldn't be truly the previous month. It would be right now as we, oh no, we haven't selected date range. So if the date range here would be fixed as well, which can be done within the sort field, date range field. So here's custom, and we say, okay, I want to have this chart show me data from the 1st of January till the 30th of January. Now it would be the previous month. But if this is tied to something like a date picker up here, this wouldn't actually be working because the previous month would obviously not be calculated. It would just be December all over again the whole time. So it is possible, kind of, but not very flexible. Now, I was hypothesizing that we might be able to build some kind of date structure tool, just like we did with the interaction filters here, and say, okay, I want to only see this until this date. And we could use this as input variables within our calculated metrics, but I'm not sure this is actually possible. Unfortunately, it's not very flexible in that sense. You can do month-to-month comparisons, but not really with these dynamic date ranges. I hope this helps, and this is also what I wrote you via email. So thanks, Ryan, for your question. And that's already it. If you have any questions in the chat, then I'll go through them right now. Vincent says, all very cool. I don't mind if you do 3 more lessons with more practical examples as you are showing today. All right. Yes, the practical examples are a bit too hard to come by as we can utilize Google Analytics. I wanted to make sure that we get through all of these in order to show how we would be able to use them. As if I utilize Google Analytics a lot, then it sometimes loads and loads and loads and loads, and I wasn't able to come up with very good examples at that stage. So maybe I'm gonna do another video on this on the channel to show the different use cases in that sense, because as they are very basic and you wouldn't be able to necessarily use them. But obviously data is always a bit depends on your case kind of thing. Vincent says, Google Search Console has the site impressions and URL impression connector. Both have the query as dimension, but when I blend the data sources, the query field doesn't work. Ideas? Okay. URL impression connector, both have the query. That's an interesting question. I would need to ask if you are blending data sources, you have 2 data sources. So what are these 2 data sources? Is this Google Analytics and Search Console? The problem might also be that Google Analytics and Google DataStudio, Google Analytics and Google Search Console can connect the data and you see it in your Google Analytics, but sometimes the actual scope is hidden to the user. So we cannot really pull out the data and say, this impression led to this conversion, as everything that happened on Google Analytics side is on the scope of the actual user and it's tied to a client ID. Now, the other scope, like Google Analytics Search Console, Google Search Console, is actually within the scope of their system. So there is no direct path to actually match that up correctly. And even though they have 2 fields, like queries, you wouldn't be able to do this sometimes. And this is an internal struggle within DataStudio all the time. I mean, you do stuff and think it should work, but it doesn't, and it doesn't really give you any kind of hint why this is happening. So I don't know if I can, if this answers your question, but it is actually something that is a concern. Let me go and actually go to the chat here. And the chat window is a bit big. That's a bug. Here we go. So, sorry if I couldn't answer the question. It's just something that just doesn't work sometimes in DataStudio. This would be my hypothesis, but in the end, I would need to look at the data sources. And the problem is that you can't really pull out that data and say, okay, I just want to connect this and this. Then you would need to do it in Google Sheets and import it all. Hope that makes sense. Tanja has a SPA question. So single page application website loads all content in the first instance and then only creates page view, VPV, whatever that means. Google Tag Manager said is fine, but I can't define events. Yes, this is oftentimes the case when the DOM is loaded via SPA. And what Google Tag Manager and what Google Tag Manager is based on is really an HTML page, as we all know it. These SPA pages, or these SPA frameworks, came out over the last recent years, and they are very heavily JavaScript based. So you don't really have a document object model that loads normally. And if you have events that are created via something like an auto event trigger, so click trigger and so on, then these also just put out code that built in a listener. If you want to dive into this, we have a course on this on a JavaScript in GTM. But if this listener doesn't pick up any interaction, then that means that the site actually doesn't, or is not a normal case for Google Tag Manager. Google Tag Manager is always built on this normal case of like a website, HTML, and so on. Unfortunately, there is no workaround to make this listener, this trigger, work in this instance, and you would need to work with your developer to resolve this. And this is the case with SPA websites very often. Why? SPA websites are not based on a framework like WordPress. They are, most of the times, custom built. And so there is already a developer that has thought through the system. The only thing that I can recommend is to sit down with the developer already at the development stage and say, okay, we need to have these events checked. So how can we make this and this and this work? I would like to do it with Google Tag Manager. Then these people will build something in, so the DOM would be ready to be installed via this trigger. Two things that I can recommend is to look into custom listeners. So build the code yourself and deploy it via custom HTML tag. And the second part would be to see if the history change listener works. Sometimes these developers actually think about, okay, what if the user clicks on the back button, and that way it will push something into the history API, which will allow you to at least fire page views and the like. That's the only tips I can give you right now. There is no one solution for SPA websites, as SPA are custom built, and that's why it's not on a single system that I could do a video on and then everybody would magically know what to do. So I hope that helps. It asked me to choose a data layer. Any tips on how to learn more about Storyblock SPA works with event tracking? Storyblock itself doesn't supply any documentation. Wow. So Storyblock, I mean, I can also just quickly Google it here, but Storyblock. So I see that they have a API. Okay, well, no, I would need to look into it more. Unfortunately, that's not something that I can answer at the moment. Sorry. Yeah, you are firing virtual page views. That's fine for Google Analytics at least. Vincent says that both data sources are Google, both have query, and I would like to connect them. One would see how keywords rank with what URL. Interesting. So if it doesn't work, even if it's within a system, either this is a bug inside of the system itself, I wouldn't have an explanation why that is. Or Google Search Console actually blocks this from happening because it doesn't want you to connect your impressions to the actual URL, which is obvious, which would make sense to me because DataStudio oftentimes, or Google oftentimes, is very selective of what data they actually give you. Because if you knew the URL and the query, then you could go into your Google Analytics and you could push a custom dimension in and basically have the query again, or the search term. And that would maybe open them up to other SEO tools crawling that data and spamming the index or so. This is just a hypothesis, right? I don't know what's going on in the minds of Google, especially in the search team. They have done some crazy stuff over the years. So that would be my hypothesis. Although it's in the same tool, there wouldn't be a reason, right? But it doesn't work. So maybe that's the case. Cool. And Tanja says, working with dev is not an option in my case, but great to have your point on this. We'll look into custom listeners and history change listener. Yeah, this is something, this whole, if you're not working with the dev, I mean, Google Tag Manager gives us the ability to get a bit away from the developer, right? Or at the beginning, at least it did. But at the same time, it is still crucial to involve them. And if you don't have the opportunity to talk to a developer, especially if you have a out-of-the-box system. Let's say you go with something like Shopify, right? Where you can only change certain parameters of the platform. You cannot change it completely and that's what makes Shopify so powerful. But at the same time, it makes it so inflexible for us. Now, yeah, working with a developer would be always preferred, but we all don't have the ability. So we always need to look at what are the trade-offs here, how can we do it? And obviously there's also technology restrictions, unfortunately. So we would be able, we wouldn't, yeah. There are technology restrictions that we can't get around, and therefore it's not something that is an option. All right, guys. Vincent says that's probably it. Google doesn't want it. that would be my interpretation of things. It would be great if it would be possible, right? All right, guys. This was fun. Thank you for joining. If you are live, thanks for watching this on the replay. If you have any questions, then leave them in the comments below after the fact on this video, and definitely let me know how you like this, if you have any feedback, and if we could, if you have any more use cases that I could go through, it would be great. Unfortunately, sometimes I don't have the data set to sometimes look into these different, or come up with these great use cases. It's actually something that, yeah, frustrated me a little bit, just because Google Data Studio sometimes is so slow, and then you try out a formula and you think, oh, now it should work. And then you load the whole data set and it takes a minute, and then no, it doesn't work. So I opted in this case for these little examples in terms of the, in terms of the Google Sheet, and I just made up some examples. So I hope this helped you out. Anyways, great to have chatted with you. Great for this wrap for this month's Measure Masters training. Please let me know how you thought about it, and I'll see you hopefully next time. My name is Julian. Till next time.